Let me tell you the story of Gemspears. It was my longest running fort. For a long time it was my most prosperous fort. It was brought to the brink of collapse once, but it clung to life. And in a fort that has run for over 20 years in game time, naturally there have been a great many stories to spring up to it. Lots of events, lots of characters, and lots of subplots. But let me take you on a walk now through the hallowed, haunted, echoing halls of Gemspears. As you approach the entryway, you may notice a strange set of pumps and walls leading up from the river. It is said that once upon a time these pumps took water from the river and poured it through the main thoroughfares of the fort, creating an enormous misting waterfall, and any dwarf who passed beneath the spray was said to be soothed of all his troubles. You'll quickly pass by the old farmland, once full of plump helmets and tended by the farmer dwarves. There is also a coliseum in which the dwarves would often pit captured beasts against one another in fights to the death. Remind me sometime, and I'll tell you the story of the vampire versus the minotaur. That was a duel for the ages. After this, you'll see the enormous hall of workshops and stockpiles, but where a din of dwarven labor once rang through the chamber at any hour of the day, there is now silence. Enormous piles of gems and other goods now go untouched. If you want to know where they've gone, we'll need to venture deeper into the caverns. We're approaching the floor of the great dining hall now, and I'll have to ask you to watch your step. Don't take my warning lightly. If I could have given it to the dozens of dwarves who once roamed these halls, they might not stand empty today. You must especially mind the floor grates as we head toward the dining hall. You remember the waterfall machine I told you of as we came in? This was once the main thoroughfare for that waterfall's drainage. From here it trails on into the underground caverns running off to Armok knows where. Maybe this drainage is what first awoke the bane of the fortress. But at any rate, it did not help once the threat found its way into the fortress. I hope you didn't step in anything on your way over the grate. If you did, you'll know soon enough. You may have tracked through such mundane things as dirt and sand and dwarven blood, but let me just say, I hope you wore thick shoes. Now here you might see a hastily constructed wall. Did some blood seep through the cracks before the room inside finally fell silent? Probably. If we could walk through these walls, you would see the old Gemspears hospital. You would see tables and beds all full of the skeletal remains of dozens of dwarven men, women, and children. Likely a lot of dried blood still remains on all the furniture and walls. Around the corner here you may see Gemspears' mass tomb. It wasn't always the intent of the citizens to carve out a rudimentary tomb right next to the fort's hospital, but it was a matter of necessity. There is hardly a dwarf living on the soil of Gemspears that does not know of this tomb, but hardly a soul remains that could name even one of the citizens who rest inside. All that's left now is the great dining hall. Now, though, there is not much to say about it, except that it is only a shell of its former self. No more will the sounds of dwarven arguments and songs ring against the polished marble walls. Just a couple more floors deeper, and you'll have your answers about what happened to the dwarves of Gemspears. Here in the natural underground caverns, the bane of Gemspears sits to this very day. Just over the dark hills here, there it is. That awkward little pile of unfinished walls and caked blood was the downfall of Gemspears. Other forts are known to fall to the goblin hordes or fire-breathing dragons or even frozen water sources and starvation. With Gemspears, it was the forgotten beast Lene, an enormous leech whose corpse still lies in the vacuous caves that birthed it. And indeed, Lene is now a corpse. He has been for many years. In fact, he did far more damage to the dwarves of Gemspears in death than he did in his wretched life. The soldiers of Gemspears had dealt with many a forgotten beast in their time. They cleared the caverns of the miserable troglodytes and fought back raiding goblins time and time again on the surface. With Lene, the operation seemed no different. Upon hearing of the threat in the caverns, they charged in and killed Lenne before he had the chance to get anywhere near the innocent dwarves living their peaceful lives in the fortress. The beast did not even wound one soldier that day, but it was when they spilled his blood that they ultimately doomed their fellow dwarves. The beast's filthy blood was tracked in by the soldiers, having splattered on their armor and stuck to the bottoms of their boots. When they stepped through the mist of the fort's artificial waterfall, the blood washed out onto the floor, into the stairwells, and many other obscure corners of the fort. The soldiers were safe from what followed due to their steel armor, but the ordinary citizens were not so fortunate. In the days that followed, several dwarves started reporting into the hospital. It was an admittedly strange sight for the medical staff, who mostly tended to dwarves who had been wounded in battle or ambushed by goblins while walking outdoors. These dwarves had a more peculiar complaint, a complaint of pain in their feet. In fact, the problem was that the flesh of their feet was rotting away while they still lived. It was a mysterious affliction at first, but in the days to come, every dwarf in Gemspears would know its name: beast rot. A few dwarves could be saved. Those lucky few who were infected first. The doctors were able to excise the rotten tissue from their feet and allow them to return to somewhat normal lives. But then the patients poured in. In seemingly moments, the hospital was flooded with new patients suffering from the beast rot. In what was formerly an overly spacious facility, the operating tables and beds quickly fell much too short. Given enough time, the medical staff might have been able to save every dwarf, but the full horror of the plague had yet to set in. Attempts were quickly made to quarantine the site of Lenne's original death, so that no more blood could be tracked into the halls of the fort. Unfortunately, the damage was already done, and sending mason dwarves into the site of the beast's death only served to exacerbate the problem. The final horror struck when it was discovered that the medical dwarves themselves were infected with the beast rot. In fact, they suffered the worst afflictions of any dwarves in the fort. You see, the dwarves were unaware of proper quarantining and sterilizing methods. As a result, a great deal of Lenne's toxic blood stayed around the tables and floors of the hospital, while most affected dwarves were seeing their feet rot away after walking through pools of the beast's blood. The doctors had broken out into a full-body necrosis due to their intimate contact with their patients. It wasn't long before their own beast rot entirely stopped them from working to help the other sufferers. In the weeks to come, the population of Gemspears was decimated. More and more dwarves flocked to the hospital, where there was no more help to be found. In a final desperate effort, the hospital was sealed behind a brick wall. Many dwarves still lived inside, but those few outside who were still safe knew that it was inevitable that they would all die from their sickness in there. It was a horrible fate to condemn them to, but it was all that could be done to save those dwarves who still lived. In the end, it wasn't enough to seal off one room of the fort. Pools of toxic blood could still be seen in various places around the halls. Perhaps you could say that the remaining dwarves felt unsafe in these diseased halls. Perhaps they felt guilt over the act of sealing so many fellow dwarves in the blood-splattered hospital. Perhaps the enormous halls of the fortress grew too quiet and lonely in light of those already dead. Who can say if any of those original underground citizens are even still living? If they are, they would all tell you a similar story. But if you didn't live down there yourself, you might not believe it. But they say those remaining dwarves were driven out by the angry ghosts of their fallen brothers. Such an act would surely weigh heavily on the conscience of anyone, man and dwarf alike. Maybe the ghosts were all in their minds, but on the sight of so much suffering and death, who can say? What remained of the fort was about a dozen military dwarves, and no more than 5 or 6 civilians who either had their rotten tissue excised before it could spread too far, or wore sturdy enough shoes to avoid the deadly blood, or just happened to avoid it somehow. There was an exodus of these dwarves to the surface, and the entire underground section was quarantined. Now these citizens, and more who have come along since, live out their days in an above-ground fort constructed out of stone. Work is slow here, but they have returned to some semblance of a normal life. Military dwarves and others who wear metal boots are granted special access to the old fort, which they use to conduct occasional salvage missions, returning items such as valuable ores, weapons, armor, and special artifacts from the underground. Gemspears has managed to keep a well-maintained military, and the population has bounced back to a reasonable 68 dwarves. Nothing compared to their original numbers, but they're happy enough. A dwarf is generally not built for an above-ground life, but the dwarves of Gemspears live so, and they live in deference to their foolhardy predecessors, still working to memorialize every dwarf who died to Lenne's beast rot, for they know all too well what will happen if a dwarf doesn't watch his step.